Good morning and good afternoon, I guess, depending on where you are. My name is Shana Bushyhead Condill. I'm a citizen of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians and the executive director of the Museum of the Cherokee People. We're located on the Qualla boundary in Western North Carolina in the Great Smoky Mountains. Welcome. We're so happy that you're here today. And thank you as well to Melissa, Elizabeth, and Heather for being willing to participate. It's been an honor to work with Jean Quick-to-See-Smith on this exhibition, The Land Carries Our Ancestors, which is installed currently at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And she is always adamant about having an educational experience as part of the work she does. And so I'm so happy to participate in this lecture series to help achieve those learning objectives that Jean has, and I know our guests are as well. I'm going to introduce everybody, and then I'll ask Melissa to take it away. Melissa Melero-Moose is Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe. She's a founder, curator of Great Basin Native artists. And I was very excited to meet Melissa at the opening of The Land Carries Our Ancestors, where Melissa's stunning piece is a part of the exhibition. And I'm sure she'll speak about that a little bit as well. I have not yet had the honor of meeting ElizabethAWoody in person yet. She is of the Confederated Tribes of the reservation at Warm Springs, Oregon, but I'm a great admirer. And I was just saying earlier that Jean speaks very highly of her, as she does everyone on the panel. Elizabeth is the first Native Poet Laureate of Oregon and the director of the museum at Warm Springs. And finally, Heatherahtone, Choctaw Chickasaw Nation, has been an incredible support to me personally. And also a supporter of our work at the Museum of the Cherokee People. She exemplifies Native leadership for me, and we are always grateful for her expertise. She is the director of curatorial affairs at the First Americans Museum in Oklahoma City, and she also wrote a key essay for The Land Carries Our Ancestors catalog, which for me, and I hope our readers, serves as a bridge between mainstream art history and Native interpretation. So the theme for today is leadership, which was very exciting for me. And I never feel like we're going to have enough time to dig into everything that we'll want to talk about, but the theme of leadership is a good one. I believe that everyone has a leadership role in the world, in family relationships, in community, at work. And I'm hoping that each of our panelists will be able to reflect on what it means to them to be a leader. The other thing I want to note is that all of our panelists are Native women, and that's also exciting for me. I would like to ask our panelists also to reflect a bit about how that plays into the responsibilities you feel in the work you do. And so without further delay, let's go ahead and get started, and I'll ask Melissa to join me.
Thank you so much, Pijama. Thank you all for being here today. I hope I can figure this out. No. All right. I'm going to talk a little bit about my homelands and my artwork and the Great Basin Native artists. So this is a map of the Great Basin region. I'm in the northern Nevada area in Reno. I'm from the Toitacata. We're the cattail eaters. Our tribes identify ourselves as the things that we eat from our areas. So we have about 32 tribal communities, Northern Paiute, Nama, Washoe, Washishu, Western Shoshone, Nuwa, and Southern Paiute, the Nuwuvi. I also have family connections in Northern California, Fort Bidwell area, and Central Oregon, Modoc. I think a lot of people, I think when I was doing artwork in the Southwest area, I had to show people a map of the Great Basin. When I said the words, the Great Basin, people didn't know what I was talking about. And it is mostly, takes up most of the Nevada area, Eastern Sierra, parts of Oregon, parts of Idaho, and Utah. And so it's a big space, and it seems to be kind of like a void that people forget about our area. They can't imagine that we have so many tribal communities in this area. This is the piece that I have in the exhibition, The Land Carries Our Ancestors. It's called Access Denied. I think it has a lot of different layers. I started with the basket design, and from there I started thinking about just how hard it is for our basket weavers to get access to materials. And that leads to, limited access to our, traditional lands and our sacred sites. And then, of course, our weavers having problems getting access to their, natural materials for weaving. Our pine nuts, which are on the canvas as well. That was, a main part of our sustenance. And now in this day and age, just really excited to get your hands on pine nuts because they're super yummy. And, it's something that, we look forward to in the fall time. And they come out, I think that's where the colors started to come in with a piece like this, and the process of talking about fall time, talking about water, and just sort of piling those layers on top of a piece like this, and telling that story. These are my other pieces. I just showed like an example of my work, and then also sort of, the things that I was thinking of, the burden basket, the cone shape of the burden basket. And that's sort of where I'm, putting that in sort of abstraction over here. I've got pine nuts on there. I've got circular, sort of, I was kind of thinking of like personal petroglyphs, where I'm putting in imagery that's just sort of coming to me, talking to me about the work, the area that I live in, the people, the land, all the things that, that are special to me in a place like this and living in a place like this. This is Pyramid Lake. And so we've got just multiple colors throughout the year. Sometimes it's turquoise, sometimes it's dark blue, sometimes it's just all these different colors of blues. And so my palette does sort of stay in that area. Pine nuts, I put a lot of pine nuts on my canvases, talking about, like, I think this one's called like The Gathering or Pine Nut Harvest, the one in the middle, an abstraction of basketry and our pine nuts, and just sort of the layering of the textures and stuff. A lot of these pieces, they're sort of protruding and sticking out of the canvas. And then the last one is of a basket, a baby basket hood. You see on the last picture, that's my son, and the little hood comes out. And this is sort of what the hood looks like when you're weaving the basket, and that little hood part and the little shade, sunshade part, when you're getting ready to put all of the pieces together for the baby cradle board. Okay, so I'm going to start talking about the Great Basin Native artists. I went to the Institute of American Indian Arts in the early 90s, and I started to work with a lot of the different peers that I had from different places. And I was in Santa Fe in about 2000, working on my own art and doing galleries and stuff out there, and interacting with my peers from IAIA, and eventually sort of started to figure out how to exhibit on our own. It was really hard to get into galleries and stuff out there. So it was something that I did with America Meredith before she started First American Art Magazine, and other peers that we had there. We sort of needed a place to call our own and exhibit our own work and talk about our own work and write about our own work. And so things that were happening back home in Santa Fe sort of merged when I moved back home in 2012. And I think that's sort of the origin of how Great Basin Native artists got started. I think I have to say, if it weren't for the this first show that I was involved with, the in our sort of regional area at the Nevada State Museum, called Under One Sky. That's where I met my fellow artists. I met my peers, and I knew that there was a lot of art out there in our area. I had an opportunity to write a artist profile on Ben Alec for First American Art Magazine, and I think that's really where the conversation got started about what we were going to, what we needed as artists, and how we just enjoyed being, with each other and interacting with each other and having a reason to make art and share it with the community. And that was really, really important. But the other thing that really needed to happen was that interaction with the other regional arts organizations, museums, and spaces. And I think that's sort of where, if I were to tell anybody how to start, a collective or to really get a movement going in your region, that is the thing that really pulled everything together. Because once I had those partners in the community, I was able to really get things going. First and foremost, we made our own website. We started to sort of fake it till we make it. We were doing community health fair. This is us at a community health fair right here, and different exhibitions in different regional areas: Sacramento, Reno, Nevada, and we reached out to getting our artists into Santa Fe, Indian Market, and Herd Market, just to sort of get those experiences and get that business, sort of art business side, and also just create, have reasons to share their art with the public and just talk about, our region and our area and our concerns with everybody else. And it really just led to so many things. So cut to 10 years later, right now, we're doing a lot of interaction with the public. And it's sort of branched off into having an archive. I proposed an idea to the Nevada Museum of Art to sort of keep a record of our artists, so that we didn't have to reinvent the wheel every single time or every decade or so when they wanted to have a show. But that sort of led to, them reaching out and us interacting and having one of our first major solo shows, which was Jack Malott, and have a major publication. And that was really, really important, because that was documenting our work, documenting our place, and continuing exhibitions throughout the region and beyond. We just had an exhibition in at the Institute of American Indian Arts, Museum of Native Arts, Contemporary Native Arts in Santa Fe. And that was one of the first times where I used the archive to find my artists and have a major exhibition over there. Another thing is our gallery that's inside the Stewart Indian School Cultural Center and Museum, and our tribal partners and our future projects. It's just been really, really exciting to have something like this happen from nothing and zero, funding. It's just all working with the other, art entities and people who want to support us. So Thank you so much, Pijama. And I'll hand it off to our next presenter, ElizabethAWoody.
I'm ElizabethAWoody, and I'm the executive director at the museum at Warm Springs. And I'm the first Native executive director at the museum. Prior to being at the museum, I was a poet laureate of Oregon, first Native poet laureate. I worked as a program officer at the Meyer Memorial Trust and have been involved in leadership in a lot of different ways. Beginning in I used to teach at IAIA, Institute of American Indian Arts. When I left Santa Fe, I joined a group called EcoTrust, a nonprofit environmental socioeconomic kind of organization. And there I formed or designed the EcoTrust Leadership Award. And during that time period, I also was selected to be in the first class of the Americans for Indian Opportunity Kellogg Fellowship. And that was a major shift in my life to go there and meet other leadership. And I think that probably those two things, the EcoTrust experience and the AIO experience, helped me in working with a lot of people across the nation and bringing awareness and understanding of Native American arts, American Indian arts and cultures, and also to begin to look at the influences that the Americas had on the world, particularly through the arts. Most of our arts had been kind of pirated and taken to other places. For example, the Oregon sea otter, which was extirpated in 1908, a lot of that fur was like liquid gold. It was a major trade item in the Pacific Northwest, and it happened that they were hunted out. And a lot of that material culture that belonged to our Oregon coastal tribes and to Central Oregon and the Northwest was traded off to places like China and Russia. And I know that the Sletz tribe has gone to St. Petersburg to find items that are sea otter related and related to their tribes. So that's just an example. The Northwest itself is probably one of the Pacific Northwest is probably one of the most interesting places in terms of colonization. The Spanish came along the coast. It was really rugged. They couldn't seem to get in. They went up to the Macaws, and of course the Macaws beat them back, and they weren't able to colonize. We had the Russians coming through. Of course, they had enslaved Aleut people and to come down and to capture and hunt these sea otters in Oregon and California. The other I guess the other intruder was Great Britain. We had the fur trading company here, Hudson Bay Fur Trading Company. We also had Lewis and Clark, which until that point, all of these invaders had little influence over the Pacific Northwest. Mexico, of course, came up to Oregon borders, and our cultures, of course, did not recognize or are cognizant of these international borders, and that they were, in fact invading our country, so to speak. So anyway, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the museum's shift to be kind of for everyone, Tlaxwama Maya. And that also we want to say in this context that we have to preserve and we have to advance, and we want to share the knowledge of our cultural and traditional and artistic heritage. There are 3 tribes in the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. Whoops, how do I make this go forward? And you can see here that we've got a staff of 2. Our museum is shrunk. And we also need to talk about the 3 cultures. So here you see women dancing, and they have the patlapa or the basket hats and the buckskin dresses. Those are Warm Springs. And then we also have the Wasco people, which are very much different than the Warm Springs people. And we also have the Namu and the Paiute people. And the Namu or the Paiute people came to the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs rather late, because we were formed in, the reservation was formed in the Treaty of 1855. And we also had ancestral lands of 10.5 million acres. So part of the problem, or part of the existence of our reservation, was to remove us from the Columbia River and to remove us from the 10.5 million acres into a centralized location. And our reservation is 655,000 acres. So it's a fairly small comparison towards the 10.5, although by looking at the other reservations in Oregon, we're fairly large. This is Don Stastny. He's the architect who built the museum. And one of the things that he did that was probably most unusual, and because the Warm Springs tribes themselves decided to build this museum with their own money, he wanted to be informed by the cultures that were here on the reservation. So his office, his folks set up an office, and they met regularly with Warm Springs tribal elders and people to talk about the elements that they wanted to have in the building. And he said that experience transformed him from all future work. He realized that the aesthetic of the building had to tie to the culture of the people. And you can see here we have lava rock in the background. So this building here is the museum in totality, and it has a lot of different elements to it. One of it was incorporating the Wasco board longhouses. We had cedar plank houses. It also incorporates what's the travois, people call the travois, which are people used to traverse their large territory. And then, of course, the teepee longhouse. Teepee longhouse, which is also a Warm Springs construction, and the basketry on the side of the building. The four directions are recognized by these circles. Again, another view of this. And the thing that happened for him, it was probably why he put this word on the front, Kanat, is because the people kept saying that this is what our building is for. It's to follow. I mean, to follow for us means to follow the ancestors, to follow the teachings, but it also means for us to turn around in our leadership in our present day to invite the next generations to follow. And this ties to a lot of precepts. And for example, at the time of creation, the Creator placed us on this land, and He gave us the voice of this land, and that is our law. Teach them is a word that Warm Springs culture uses to refer to the ancient activity on the land. And it's more than a memory. It's more than a native language or human history. So the knowledge system is a cyclic pattern of activity that is governed by and also attuned to the changes in the landscape. So we have our food chiefs, and we have the essential water, which is our elements that we honor in the building and in our lives. And that's the salmon, the deer, edible roots, and berries. And so all of these things that were created to take care of those things are in this building. The museum, the tribes set aside a considerable amount of money to collect artifacts, heirlooms from the tribal people who wanted to have it housed someplace safe, because there were a lot of collectors coming to Warm Springs and purchasing these items and taking them off. And also we have here also contemporary artists. One, for example, is Lillian Pitt, my auntie. We have contemporary artists like Pat Courtney Gold, who recently passed away. She donated her basket collection. And we also have, students who've gone off to art school and they've learned painting and other kind of contemporary, quote unquote, contemporary techniques. So showing the building quickly, all of the executive directors. And we also have 5,000, we have an archives and we have a major collection. So the archives houses over 5,000 photographs and also items that are historically tied to the sovereignty of the tribes. This is a picture of our chiefs, or tribal council actually, in 1928. And we also have pictures of our elders who are now elders or now ancestors from various sources of these things, these items that we've collected. I know that most of us think of these items as being isolated objects, but they're actually tied to story, they're tied to families, they're tied to management of our land resources. They're ways that which we go back to our usual in accustomed places. And these usual and custom places, as they mentioned in our Treaty of 1855, are places that we hunted and gathered our medicine, had our ceremonial practices. So these are the older items that are housed in the collection. We have a permanent exhibit which tells our story. This is a wedding ceremonial. This is the photograph from the day of the opening. And we have recent exhibitions. We have 4 exhibits a year. This is the one from item from the most recent tribal members and youth art exhibit. We had another one that celebrated the building and the building of what it took to get this building up. Edward Heath, he's a really well-respected photographer here. Another item from the exhibit. We also rent traveling exhibits. This was Faces from the Land, a photographic journey through Native America by Ben and Linda Mara, and that's Leona Ike, who is a tribal member pictured here. Savages and Princesses was a very well-attended exhibit, and we had a lot of media on this. It was interesting. So most of the people that we show also in our smaller galleries or our exhibits tend to be on subjects that are important to us. Wildfires are very, very rampant in Oregon. There were a couple of days the museum had to close because the smoke was the worst in the world. There's an app that you can go and look at, and it showed that we had the worst quality air in the entire world, beating out Beijing, Tokyo, all of these places that are notorious for bad air. So one of our curators had designed this show for that. So our tribal member art show is pretty famous for our local people. They love it. And they also spend all year making art for it. In our 2018, it was our 20th year anniversary. We displayed original documents from the Treaty of 1855. And this was, I wasn't a director here at that time, but it was pretty hard to get everything up to quality. And that's probably why we need to have, we note that the museum was built to Smithsonian quality standards. And part of the reasoning for that was at the time before the National Museum of the American Indian was actually built, the concept was that the tribal museums would essentially become the external museums for the Smithsonian. So the first museum to meet that standard was, I think, our museum. And we, of course, were the first in Oregon. We are in a cottonwood ecosystem, which is very unique and critical in the high mountain desert, and it requires a lot of upkeep. Mostly we're doing this for fire management. And we're right next to Shatite Creek, which is a creek that has waters that come off of Mount Jefferson, or other words known as Sequoia. And it's part of our sacred waters and part of our cyclic system of food. The water comes from the mountains, goes through our creeks, which takes care of the salmon, it takes care of all of the life on it, goes to the ocean through the Great Columbia River drainage system. So we have traditional master art classes, which also tends to be dependent on whether or not we get our funding. And I know that that's probably really crucial for us, but most of our traditions are passed on orally through families, person to person. And the museum has hired people to basically fill that gap for some people who want to learn these traditional techniques. This is a fully beaded baby board. The teacher Val here wanted to teach how to make rose bow baby boards. So we had to go out and find wild rose bushes and to cut them into these things that will become the cradle board. And roses protect the baby. And in more ways than one, it's spiritual. And she wanted to teach those aspects that aren't like in a book and couldn't be just put down in directions, and tell the stories that she has in her family. So these women came to learn how to do it. This woman was really shy. It was a very intensive class. As you can see, there's the students. So the next class we had was cornhusk basket weaving hat, the putlapas, and Eileen Spiner was our teacher. And she worked very well one-on-one with the students to start working on the corn husk. The corn husk is itself a different kind of like a technique. It's not just weaving. And it has its stories attached to it as well. And some of the weavers here are pretty proficient. They're really good. But they wanted to come to hear the stories. They wanted to see what the teacher had to share. This was another one of our classes that took us out on the land, and it was tule mat making class. We made tules to be our covering for our longhouses and for our what used to be called teepees, or what people call teepees now. It's a very good insulation material, and it can, in the winter, it swells to close, and in the summer it dries to open up, so ventilation comes through. So these things that happen in the classroom are part of what we call hand-to-hand knowledge, and that it's very important for some of these students to come in and just basically be helpers. So you can see there's a younger set here. Gordon, this is just your basic weaving class. They have to come through this class before they can do the advanced classes. We have cedar coil basket making happening this weekend, so people here can qualify for that particular class. And you can see there's many different advancements. And of course, this is the last picture of the series. This is one of our museum staff pulling up a cedar root. It takes a lot of toughness and a lot of ability to get out on the land to do that. So we had our 30th anniversary celebration. I'm just sharing this because you can see we are doing the things that other regular museums do, which is try to raise money. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to heatherahtone, and I can begin to answer questions when you're ready.
It's really a pleasure to join this panel, and I'm ever grateful for the support expressed through the invitation extended to participate in this panel and discuss the work we're doing at First Americans Museum. Thank you, Shana, with whom I've shared many conversations about our work over the last couple of years. I also want to thank Rachel and Allie and all the staff at the National Gallery for their support of the exhibition that Jean curated. And thank you to those of you who have joined us today. So my name is heatherahtone. I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation and descended from a long line of very strong Choctaw women. I'm from Oklahoma, where my tribe and my family has been located since the 1830 Indian Removal Act. When the 1830 Indian Removal Act forcibly enacted the ethnic cleansing of the American Southeast. I've been honored to speak about our work at First Americans Museum since we opened in September 2021. As Director of Curatorial Affairs, it gives me great pride to speak of this institution that I can literally take responsibility for building, working with a team of amazing folks and imagining how a museum can bring our Indigenous philosophies to the forefront of our work as we listen to the voices of our ancestors and forge a path for future generations to follow. Briefly, for those not familiar with First Americans Museum, we're located at the intersection of Interstates 40, 35, and 44 in Oklahoma City, literally at the center of the United States. The site, reclaimed from 100 years of abuse by the petroleum industry, provides a 300-acre site, of which our museum uses 70 acres. The museum operates on the mission of sharing the arts, culture, and histories of the 39 tribal nations located in Oklahoma today, all of whom experienced a forced relocation by the federal government, both initially in the 19th century and then again in the 20th century. We come from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. We have languages, the Algonquian, Anishinaabe, Athabascan, Tanoan, Salish, Siouan, and Muskogean language speakers among the 12 language families that live in Oklahoma. The multiplicity of stories that each of these tribes carry within their community and familial histories exceeds what any singular museum can share. And so while the mission is impossible, it gives us the levity to identify goals that we can meet. And so the Curatorial Affairs Office creates projects that allows us to bring our Indigenous philosophies to our work and focus on learning outcomes, such as we want to speak to the dynamic and diverse cultural environment created by these historic forces. You can see the comparison in this screen of removing the 44 nations of the European Union to the island of England. is actually quite comparable to the forced relocation of our 39 tribal nations to Oklahoma. We want to speak to our cultural resiliency, historic and present, and that have contributed to our survival against the violent and systemic efforts to erase our communities from the planet. And that we want to speak to our sovereignty as social and economically growing tribal nations. And this is a message we take very seriously and embed throughout our work. Our department carries specific responsibilities for the museum's mission. We've operated with a significant amount of autonomy and support from our executive office and from the board of directors. These areas that you're reading here, exhibitions, collections, research, and publications, overlap, obviously, but each also provides to us areas to which we can ask questions and explore how museums can shift from being sites of violence against Indigenous people to places that both welcome and edify our visitors, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And when I speak of that history of violence enacted by my museums, I want to just say that I'm speaking to that century and a half practice of museums as they were formulated out of the European tradition, certainly not against the tribal museums that Elizabeth just was speaking to. If you've heard me speak at all in the last 10 years, I always come back to this methodology and try to use it as a touch point. We are interested in making sure that people understand that this methodology provides accountability for our staff to operate, and everything that we do within our department is facilitated by this method. And we use consensus for all of our decision making. We use team-based collaboration to enact our work and prioritize our work through the lenses of respect, reciprocity, relationships, and responsibility. And having worked the last 6.5 years to get our museum open and operationally sound, the work required building relationships with our institutional partner departments, many of whom did not exist until just prior to opening in September 2021. We've begun to work forward on questions that we think matter now that the museum is open and our original research is completed. We've created these questions for ourselves, and we think maybe other people will find them interesting as well, and so I'm sharing them with you here. I'm going to discuss these 3 initiatives today as examples of the work that we are providing leadership to how museums can better foster practices and improve their relationships in regards to the collections that they hold. There are others, and I could have done this slide a million different times, but the others we're just going to have to wait. And for today, I'm going to discuss this work around focusing how we foster Indigenous creativity, our nascent shared stewardship policy, and the work we're returning to in relationship to the NMAI objects that are on loan in our Winneco gallery. During our tours, we often stop and describe that since as Native people, we had the opportunity to write the inaugural collections management policy. We brought our best thinking to this document, and I want to credit the amazing Hallie Winter, who's a citizen of the Osage Nation, who did the better part of the original writing. And within this document, and very near the first page, we describe our values. And among those values are 3 items that we actually put in bold. As an institution, we will neither collect nor store human remains under any circumstances. That we will not accept objects subject to NAGPRA unless requested to do so by a tribal nation, and that we will not accept or display items that were stolen from the graves of our ancestors. Fundamentally, these core issues are at the root of so much violence that has been enacted by museums against our Indigenous people, facilitating cultural erasure by using those sensitive materials for too long, telling our story through the lens of colonialism and domination. We brought an approach that is not specifically new to our work, but one that we all felt spoke to our ancient histories while fostering the sustainability of our continuing cultural practices. In order to represent our historic presence within the continent, we worked with tribal artists who remain skilled and knowledgeable about those historic practices that are represented by items stolen from the graves of our ancestors, and worked with contemporary living tribal citizens and who have that knowledge and skill, and ask them to replicate the items that are well known. As an example, we commissioned this mica hand, replicating the historic item commonly referred to as the Hopewell hand. And we worked with artist Tammy Rar, who's a citizen of the Cayuga Nation, to do so. As we explored creating replicas with the artists, concerned of limits on artistic license and cultural integrity, we found that the artists were honored to represent their tribal nation and to present evidence that these historic processes and techniques are alive and well. The artists want to share their community's historic practices, often with a touch of contemporaneity that an experienced eye may recognize. They were totally game to work with us in this manner and appreciated not having their cultural histories represented using objects that violate our cultural sensibilities. Having worked with the tribal nations as partners to develop our exhibitions, we extended that authority working with the tribes to identify objects targeted for commissions that honored their histories and cultural practices that would result in commissions. One of the early commissions that we enacted was for a blanket honoring the Oto War Mothers. If you're not familiar, the Oto Missouri tribe was the first in Oklahoma to establish a tribal chapter of the American War Mothers. To honor these women who take care of the families while the soldiers are deployed, we reached out through the tribal chairman's office requesting to borrow one of their robes for display. The offer was declined, but through a careful navigation of multiple priorities for the tribe and for our museum, we agreed to commission Kenetha Greenwood, who's a citizen of the Oto Missouri tribe and is also their primary graphic designer on staff. We asked her to make a blanket that honored the founding chapter members. She worked with the present members of the chapter and conceived of the blanket that you see her wearing here. The ribbon work design is borrowed from a pattern of her grandmother's, and the eagle and American flags that you see at the base along the hem are all hand beaded. As the concept of this blanket became refined and we remained in contact with the chairman's office, the request was brought that the tribe would like to be able to dance the blanket when we were not using it for display. We, of course, agreed. It made perfect sense to us as community members in our own understanding how important it was to bring these items into the community to participate culturally. But having written the collections management policy prior to actually building the collection, this capacity to share stewardship of our collection was not actually possible. So as soon as we had the bandwidth and having arrived in 2023, which was the pre-designated point to revise the collections management policy, this past year we authored and introduced a policy that allows us to operate according to the commitments we made to the community. This blanket is one example of the type of arrangement that we plan to now enact under what we call the shared stewardship policy. I know there are museums that practice this. We're very pleased to say that our board has approved this policy and we're able to move it forward. But while there is practice of the sharing collections, there has not been a policy that has broadly been instituted. We understand that the National Museum of the American Indian is similarly exploring a policy, and that's a much bigger institution. So we have a little bit more nimbleness to be effective quickly. We're currently developing the forums to enact these relationships with the objects, which will allow us to mediate relationships directly with the tribal nations through the objects that represent their community and culture. And it's also important to acknowledge that we recognize these objects as relatives, not simply inanimate materials. So those are key to how we are recognizing and making changes within our policy. And it is with the same sentiment that we have returned to a scope of our research, which we initiated during the exhibition development phase in 2019. We asked ourselves if we could rematriate the 135 objects on loan from the National Museum of the American Indian with their descendant families. I want to honor and recognize Welena Quiton, who's a citizen of the Osage Nation, and also Muskogee and Cherokee, who really initiated this question and point of inquiry. Unfortunately, during our work, this research was interrupted by the pandemic, and a conscious decision was made to stop the research so as not to place our community at risk, simply to conduct research. However, since we have been open and been able to build up the support, we are able to return to this research, currently funded by the Ford Foundation, the Henry Luce Foundation, and the Terra Foundation. We've created a target for our success, and this target has 3 concentric circles, each of which remains as much a success as the others. However, we recognize the power of community reunions, exploring the objects within the songs, prayers, languages of its relatives. And we found that there is also power in the reunion of the items with their knowledge and community and philosophy community, allowing people who work with comparable materials or related fields of cultural practice to engage with the ancestral objects. And that remains a powerful connection for all involved. But we are continuing to work with the tribal nations to see if we can identify the actual descendant families. Because the archival notes were taken by the collectors for many of the objects represented within this loan, and that the tribal names were part of those records, that's the key point that we're working out of with these with the tribes to identify the descendants. The power of all of these reunions is palpable, and you're seeing on the screen Eddie Red Eagle, who was reunited with he and his family with this Inlashka coat that was sold by his great-grandfather. And it was an item for which the NMAI learned a great deal about the object because of the reunion and the lived knowledge within our communities about these objects. We are generating new knowledge for NMAI, and it empowers the objects within the living knowledge of the objects family. And it's important work, and we're continuing to do that. Plan to release a book and a feature-length film in 2025 to record the work. As a conclusion to my presentation, I want to just share the last part of our methodology. It's our work imagining what a museum can do, interrogating the practices of museums, and cultivating practices that explore remedies to the historical and unsavory past of museums. We're doing our best, and I think that's all that we can do. We'll create questions, and other generations and other leaders will add to the conversation. But we believe that this work has proven to be enough for our community to find value in remaining partners with our work at this institution. And that's good enough for me to continue asking questions. And I thank you for your attention. And I think I'm passing it back to Shana, who I hope you might just mention a little bit about your museum.
Thank you to each of you for sharing your remarks and your work. And we have a few minutes for Q&A. So if folks listening and watching would like to share a question, then we can get to those. And Allie and Rachel, if you can prompt me if I'm not seeing them. I don't see them quite yet. So if you see any, let me know. And thank you, Heather. I appreciate that. The museum here, I think, is building. It's really interesting to see the work of all 3 of you. And I was furiously taking notes as you were each speaking, because I think we can each learn from each other, which is also just such an amazing opportunity to have when we come together to do any projects like that, because there's always something to learn from other folks that are doing the work. And so the first question I'd like you to reflect on a little bit is, and I know this isn't, how we roll normally, but you all are doing important work. And, it's not something that we want to accept necessarily, any accolades, but the fact that the 3 of you are in the roles that you're in is incredibly meaningful. It's meaningful to our communities to have Native women in these roles, and it's important to, Indian country in general. And I think, we can also understand that we're learning as just humanity from the lessons that we bring. And so if you could speak a little bit about what it means in your community or to your museum or institution, what it is that you're, what you bring to the role that maybe wasn't there previously. I know, Heather, you were speaking about museums as colonial institutions in general. And for Elizabeth's case, of course, there's it's a tribal museum, but it was, I think yours is a little older than mine. Mine is 1948. And we also had Dwayne King as our director here, which I thought was funny to see on the list. You know, he sort of made his way around. But that I think having Native leadership is relevant to that. And also, as women, what do you all bring to the table?
Well, I'll go first. One of the things that I have been having to accept in my role here at the Tribal Museum, Warm Springs Tribal Museum, is my ancestral place, my ancestral legacy of what's encompassed in the idea of the museum. I also have worked a long time in the field. You know, in 1980, I went to school at the Institute of American Indian Arts, and Chuck Daly was the director, and he was very kind in letting me tag along in a lot of the museum studies activities, because I was just innately interested, but I wasn't in that program. I was a creative writing major, two-dimensional arts. And so, yeah, there's that history. And then 12 years I worked with my Aunt Lillian Pitt, who's an artist. I was her studio manager. But during that time, I worked with ahtone. I worked with a lot of ad hoc groups of people who were doing studies and surveys on how art services organizations weren't reaching out far enough to include people like our communities. Everything was centered in Portland and Seattle. And of course, I was on the board of Crow Shadow Art Institute during its founding. I was on the Arts Committee board for the Evergreen State Longhouse's beginning. So I was there during a lot of important happenings and at the beginning of a lot of startups. And part of what I learned during those startups had to do with the old guard's attitude towards the contemporary artists and poets and writers out there. And I spent a lot of my energy in my writing, researching and getting to sources to find out, the kind of the nascence of our struggles. And some of it, I think, have come to the forefront now. For one, murdered Indigenous women and men. I have some poems in my first book that talk about that, and that people that we know had completely disappeared, including prior to that, people in my family, and their murders were never investigated. So, I mean, there's just this long arc of time. And I was also raised by very strong women. Lillian Pitt is an example. Her older sister is my mother. Their mother was my grandmother, who raised me, and she was an Indian doctor, and her husband asked her not to practice anymore. But I have spiritual legacy on both sides of my family, Navajo side and Warm Springs side. So my uncle told me that you walk with one leg in your legacy and you walk in goodwill. He said, you always have your ancestry and you have your goodwill. You carry both of those things when you walk into a room. And I'm cognizant of that. And I go places. First, it's kind of hard to ignore me because of my size, but also I do tend to be very interested in what is transpiring. So as a leader, I'm listening more than I'm ever acting. And I find a lot of the younger leadership right now, and this is not just the artistic leadership, but the political leadership and our spiritual leadership, they want all the accolades and they want to be propelled by this great energy without having gone through some of the knockdown dragouts that has happened generations before them. My mother was a very active political activist. We were part of a lot of movements in the Pacific Northwest, the Salmon Wars, for example, the political coalition from Seattle down to San Francisco, the marches, the American Indian movement, all of that. So I think when I come into this position, I brought a lot of cachet from my professional life, but I also bring to it my ancestral legacy and my what I think of as the thread of power that comes from the past and that will be going towards the future. And my life in this time period is very small. when you're looking at this large arc. So my femininity, my womanness, my femaleness, whatever it is really important, because we participate in a system in its traditional forms that recognizes that importance. You know, women are very important in this legacy. There would be no people without women. So I think that's part of it. That's all I'm going to say. But when you asked that question, that's what came to mind, you know, was this big arc that we are walking on.
Thank you. Heather or Melissa, do you want to share anything on that one?
Melissa, do you want to say anything?
Well, I do understand that that responsibility as a female leader. It's it is a big weight. I think a lot of all Native people, Indigenous people, carry that responsibility, and for women, I guess, within our society, and most of our sort of matriarchy taken away, and living in a patriarchy society has sort of like opposite world for us, you know, and I feel like a lot of our women leaders, our female leaders, are taking it back, and it's just so exciting, and just giving us this power to have this voice that has been silenced for so long. For me, the work that I'm doing in Nevada, I think I was always a reluctant leader. I didn't even realize I was leading or I was building something. I just started it, and I hoped that people would join me and take over, actually. and it ended up being something that I had to keep doing and keep building on, and keep, you know, inviting people to come along with me to tell our stories of our Indigenous people and tell our stories of our women and, you know, our missing and murdered out here, our stories of our lands, the minings that goes on out here, and the fallout from the nuclear testing sites. That's sort of a major concern out in our area. And just sort of the invisibility and the racism that our people face. So, you know, to come to be able to do what I do and get that message out there, talk about our peoples, share and educate about our community, especially working with within our gallery inside of the Stewart Indian School Cultural Center and Museum. It's a great opportunity to talk about the boarding school tragedy, you know, that sort of, you know, Canada and America was put through for a whole century. And my parents were a part of that, and my grandparents and my great-grandparents. And so to be a part of that educational museum and cultural center, and to be able to share our art and our story with the public that had no idea that this happened in our country, is an honor that I get to, you know, talk about that and get, you know, our future generations to educated about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. Heather, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I mean, so many good words have been said, and I don't want to duplicate anything. But I will just say I agree, and really want to just say that, like, you know, being recognized as a leader, as Melissa said, sometimes, you know, it's a reluctancy, right? Like, you just step into the role because and I have to say, though, that I do think that in some ways, maybe that comes out of my matriarchal upbringing in the Choctaw community, or maybe that is a result of just having two older brothers that were really bossy to me, and I love them both. But, you know, figuring out my way in the world, finding space for myself in the world. And But I also really understand that, the responsibility that comes with this work, it's sometimes very difficult to express to people who are not operating with the responsibilities that it is carried within our cultural communities, right? Like I've spoken of this before, is that, you as a curator, when I put an exhibition together, my colleagues do not deal with the pressure about whether they're being judged by their aunties and their grandparents and the community members who are going to, I promise you, they're going to let me know. I mean, we were open maybe 2 or 3 months and we already had a list of things we were going to fix in the galleries. We're working our way through that list. And that kind of personal judgment from people that you want to please, right? Like that you have a personal accountability to, and understanding that every decision that I make, every plan that I initiate, that there are people watching me, right? Like in my community. And I was speaking at a national panel some years ago, and I was talking about this and looking out, and I'm like, yeah, there's not anybody in the community right now, but they're always potentially there. And I had barely finished that sentence, and like 4 people from my tribal executive leadership like walked in the back office, and they were standing there. And so I know I always have to operate within a certain accountability for who I'm representing as a Chickasaw person, as a Choctaw person, as an Indigenous woman, and being positioned sometimes in a room where I'm the only Native person, where I'm the only, woman in the room, and understanding that I carry all that responsibility with me is both, like, some days incredibly daunting, but it is also something that I don't think my peers feel the level of support that I do from the community, right? And I don't think they feel that constant presence of our ancestors. There's been times I've been in rooms and I know that I would have been crushed by the pressures of it if it had not been for my ancestors whispering in my ears the things I needed to say, and keeping at the forefront of my mind the power that we carry within these roles. I also work really diligently within my department that I have, where I have, a certain authority, but also supporting it within the museum more broadly as part of the executive leadership, is that we have to not frame ourselves within this these issues of feminism and chauvinism. And I think that, we can have strong men leaders who are sensitive and kind and generous, nurturing people. And we can have strong women who can hold the court when the time is needed. And I think that recognizing that we all have a place and a role within the work, as we do all the consultations we do with the tribes, we learned very early on, we always needed to have a man present. We always needed to have a woman present, because the conversation could shift. And the gendering, as we respect the knowledge and philosophies of our cultures, that we have to be also prepared to respect that not all knowledge is for everyone. And managing our way through those, research mechanisms, there are just some things that we have learned are more effective than others. Always, I feel like the more that I learn about our original teachings, the stronger I get to perform the responsibilities and duties that I carry with my job. And as those change, I don't know, I feel like every time I can look back and go, "Ooh, I grew here, and that got me ready for this next role." And so I don't know what would be next, but I certainly feel like it is our responsibility to carry that forward and also nurture the next generation of leaders in the process. And so I think those are things that I carry as a woman, but not simply as a woman. I think those are part of my responsibility to the community, my own tribal community, but certainly the intertribal community we have here in Oklahoma.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think we're at time, and I want to be really respectful of all of your time as well. I'll say that I really appreciate what each of you has shared and what you shared just now. I think I'll say too, for me, Jean has exemplified those qualities that you each were just speaking about, and thinking about the battles that you all have been through that are generations ahead of us, preparing for next generations. And we're doing the same, preparing for, trying to assist those who will come after us in the work that we do. And in Cherokee, we have a word that's tohi, which means balance. And so I think Jean, in the exhibition, you can sort of see it in the selection of work that she put in the exhibition, this idea of age and origin and gender and all those things, that we need all of us, and nobody should be silent. And so I like that, and working together and to get to consensus takes a long time. It's a long process, but it ends up being something that is meaningful for our community. So with that, I think I'll close, and thank you, Shki, so much for participating, and grateful to it. And thank you, National Gallery of Art, for giving us this opportunity.